violence. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, and I should have introduced myself. Hello, I'm Katie Gotch. I serve on the NPEIV board. I'm a private practice clinician that does forensic psychology work in Portland, Oregon area. And NPEIV is an amazing organization, and I strongly encourage you to learn more about it. But in the essence of time, without further ado, we will get the session started with Dr. Pearl Berman. She is a full professor of psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She is the immediate past president of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence Across the Lifespan, that is NPEIV. A licensed clinical psychologist, she has provided treatment for the negative impact of child abuse, neglect, and family violence. Her research studies the impact of childhood adversity on adult experiences with violence. She has received the 2019 Rosalie S. Wolfe Memorial Elder Abuse Prevention Award. She collaborated with the Zero Abuse Project to create child and adult advocacy studies, which covers violence across the lifespan. She received the 2020 Child Advocacy Studies Award. It is with great pleasure, I can speak this morning, that I hand the reins over to Dr. Berman, and Pearl, it is all you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and welcome everyone. Today's webinar is going to provide you with an example of how different forms of violence may be related to each other across the lifespan. This helps illustrate why we cannot forget the past. There are common risk factors in development that can result in many forms of interpersonal violence. We will then discuss the impact interpersonal violence has on the individual victim, as well as their families, their friends, and the communities they're from. Next will be a public health approach to healing toxic stress and trauma. And we will end with a discussion of action steps that can be taken to address interpersonal violence.
And just really quick, excuse me for interrupting, I just wanted to let everyone know to please put your questions into the chat or the Q&A features. I will be keeping track of both, and we will do the presentation and then we will do the questions at the end. Thank you.
So when you look at the problems on our screen, they may seem different from each other, but in fact, they have a lot in common. The great human loss to society, the huge financial costs to us, and sharing some common risk factors from childhood. I will be providing you with some background about these common risk factors. In addition, I will be providing a simulated case history to help try to make the information I'm giving you come alive for you so that you can see how addressing these adverse childhood experiences could have a very powerful impact on reducing future acts of interpersonal violence. Growing up with abuse is a guided apprenticeship in how to be abusive and tolerate being abused. Our understanding of the impact of this childhood tutorial comes from the seminal and continuing work of Drs. Felitti, Anda, Nordberg, and others that began in 1998 and brought our attention to how adverse childhood experiences, such as those you are seeing on the screen, are the most significant predictors of adult physical and psychological health. 2/3 of us have one or more of these ACEs, adverse experiences. 11% have 5 or more. Dr. Felitti's research group created this pyramid to illustrate how these early adverse experiences could lead to the increased likelihood of violence across the lifespan. Our bodies and brains are flexible and adapt and grow based on our experiences. Toxic stress in childhood leads to increased stress hormones flooding our brains. The longer that happens, the more likely it leads to a brain where anger or fear and impulsive behavior are in more control of decision-making than carefully thinking through and considering present and future consequences. The more impulsive, angry, or fearful child is less able to develop healthy social relationships with peers and maybe become isolated or turn to antisocial groups. This increases the likelihood of involvement in risky behavior, such as early sex, drug and alcohol abuse, and dropping out of school. As adults, they have poor social skills and less ability to resolve conflicts effectively. They experience more relationship and employment stresses, all of which are related to the development of chronic diseases and the development of psychological problems. If we comprehensively address childhood adversity, we could stop this negative trajectory. Our past doesn't have to define our future, but we can't expect children to get themselves off this trajectory. I will use the lives of Katie and Johnny that I created based on my past clinical experiences to illustrate how adverse childhood experiences can lead to lifelong risk for violence. Katie and Johnny both grew up with the direct negative impact of being abused and neglected, as well as the indirect impact of witnessing intimate partner violence and alcohol abuse. Their young lives were filled with toxic stress, which affected how their brains were developing. The kindergarten teacher was the first to report Katie to Child Protective Services after noticing visible bruising on her neck and arms. Johnny's abuse wasn't noticed. His aggression was, and he was repeatedly punished in class or sent to the principal's office. In the first grade, Johnny ended up in the nurse's office after a fight, and she sent the first report to Child Protective Services after seeing signs of physical abuse. Child Protective Services did have the money to assess and recommend actions to the parents. However, they didn't have the money to both do comprehensive follow-up as well as investigate the new cases that came in. Thus, the only outcome to the reports to Child Protective Services were that Katie and Johnny got beatings at home for bringing trouble to the family. If Child Protective Services had been able to decrease violence and improve childcare in their families, Katie and Johnny might have been able to concentrate in school and see that there were adults who would help them. Instead, Katie became more depressed, anxious, and withdrawn. Johnny became more angry, hostile, and aggressive. In Pennsylvania, in a survey that went out in 2020, adults indicated that as children, 37% indicated they were emotionally abused, 28% came from divorced families, and 26% were physically abused. Katie and Johnny were bullied starting in kindergarten. They weren't allowed to learn to read. No one had helped them learn to count. Their clothing was tattered, all reasons that made them stand out and make them easier targets for bullying. How common is bullying in Pennsylvania? Through the anonymous youth survey in 2019, a quarter of our students say they were bullied in the past year. 54% say adults did take action. But remember, that means almost 50% did not. They said bullying was usually happening at school. About a quarter received a physical injury. About 2/3 were emotionally abused with insults and name calling, and 21% received inappropriate sexual content using technology. Not all victims of bullying have high childhood adversity scores, but the Katies and Johnnies just have an increased risk for being bullied, being the bully, or both. Preventing future violence requires that both the person harmed and those doing the harm get effective help. Katie had barely noticed the two boys hovering near the girls' bathroom, as she was always looking at the floor as she went through the halls. She was a social isolate, so she left the bathroom alone. This made her seem like a good target for the two boys. One grabbed her and threw her hard on the ground, and one held her and tried to pull off her pants. It was at this moment that Johnny came out of the bathroom. For a moment, he thought of just walking away, but his eyes caught Katie's and he stepped in, swinging hard. In that instant, they became constant companions at school. Any youth could become a victim of sexual assault if they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, a teen who missed the bus had to walk home in the dark and cross the path of a perpetrator. However, someone with many adverse childhood experiences like Katie may be less able to recognize signs that they are in an unsafe situation or around an unsafe person. About a quarter of our sexual offenders are minor, and about a quarter of victims are under 12 years of age. Neither Katie nor Johnny reported the sexual assault. This is not unusual, which is why in Pennsylvania, there's a Safe to Say Something crisis center. This center gets anonymous tips and then sends them to each school about who might be in danger of suicide or self-harm, who might be being bullied or taking drugs. At this time, 35% of tips relate to suicide and 22% to self-harm and 21% to bullying. The information that the center gets is just the tip of the iceberg, as most students and staff do not recognize the warning signs of a child or teen in trouble. We need to recognize that violence and other forms of antisocial and destructive behavior are warning signs that a child is or has been victimized and needs help despite maybe not asking for it. The past can't be forgotten in addressing current problems. The Johnnies in life, caught for harming someone in school, need help, as well as the Katies. Both had a history of childhood adversity that set the stage for this current sexual assault. In high school, Johnny began hanging out with the same students who were selling drugs at school. They were the one group that allowed him to hang out with them. He acted as their muscle and was given drugs as payment. Being high was a way to ease the pain of Katie and Johnny's home life. However, anyone who's looking for excitement and encouraged by peers may experiment with drugs and alcohol. Recent surveys show that starting in the 6th grade and accelerating with grade level, youth are being offered alcohol or drugs while at school, making it easier for them to make an impulsive and serious mistake, especially those with high childhood adversity scores. There were many times growing up that Katie wondered if she might be better off dead. Johnny was her best friend, and he did protect her from bullying and harassment at school. However, he also took his frustration and rage out against her in dating, violence, and sexual assault. How many people are at risk for suicide in Pennsylvania? At this time, Allegheny County has the highest suicide rate at 13 to 14 people per 100,000. Not all of those who self-harm or commit suicide are also victims of violence. However, as adverse experiences increase, suicidal thoughts and actions increase. Johnny and Katie got married right out of high school. Abuse from their parents had now ended, but the dating violence continued as intimate partner violence. Why? Johnny had started out rescuing Katie from sexual assault. He understood they were both victims of child abuse, and they still sometimes shared their pain about it with each other. Yet knowing about her past pain did not stop him from inflicting more pain on her now. Why did their experiences continue, even after freed from their violent parents? Remember the pyramid. They grew up with toxic stress. Their parents couldn't teach them skills they didn't know. They did teach them that alcohol abuse can be used to decompress at the end of a hard day. They did teach them that violence was the way to solve problems. Why didn't Katie just leave Johnny? Relationships are complex. They fill many different needs for each partner. Johnny was Katie's only friend. Her attachment to him was built on her prior isolation and loneliness before meeting him. Her past history of violence made his assaults seem normal to her, and his history of saving her from a traumatic sexual assault and constant bullying in school had made her feel deeply loyal to him. They had a dangerous relationship, but they were each other's best friend. Katie's might also not leave Johnny's because they are threatened with death if they try to leave, or of having their children taken from them. Does violence ever stop? Katie continued his physical abuse of Katie. I apologize. Johnny continued his physical abuse until after driving drunk when he was 69, he ended up in a wheelchair. Unable to physically dominate her, he still tried to control her using threats of violence and emotional abuse. Sometimes she did do as he told her, but now sometimes she began to hit him or threaten to push him down the stairs into the basement. Johnny had no one but Katie to help him. 3 of their 4 children had run away from home as teenagers, never to return. Their youngest, Bill, entered the military and then did return home. However, Bill didn't hesitate to use violence against either of his parents if they irritated him. He also didn't hesitate to demand money from them, money Katie and Johnny could ill afford. Again, he used violence if he needed it to get money. Bill's pathway to becoming a violent adult is an example of how the intergenerational transmission of violence occurs. Bill did free himself from child abuse by leaving home. He did learn many valuable skills in the military, but his own past history of abuse and neglect were never addressed. He was never given help learning the social and problem-solving skills that could help him overcome his abusive past and learn to live a nonviolent lifestyle. Elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation don't always occur due to adult children who were abused, becoming abusive and exploitive caretakers of their now older adult parents. However, an adult child who was threatened or neglected or beaten is at higher risk for abusing their adult parent than those who were not abused or neglected. Should Bill be sent to prison for elder abuse? Studies in prisons show that across many different cultural groups, white, Black, and Latino, our incarcerated population have high childhood adversity scores. We must address their past childhood adversity if our incarcerated Katie and Johnny's are going to not engage in future acts of violence.
About 3 minutes, Pearl.
Some populations are more vulnerable to violence than others, even if they don't have high childhood adversity scores. Anyone who's different from the mainstream, such as due to their racial or ethnic background, their ability status, their sexual orientation, can increase their risk. Oh, excuse me. Statistics show that people with a disability, for example, are victimized at substantially higher rates than those who do not have these challenges. People with more than one disability are at even higher risk. It can be difficult for someone with trouble talking clearly to make a report that authorities find credible. It can be difficult for someone who can't get by without physical help with toileting, dressing, and eating to report someone who's stealing from them out of fear of losing this critical help. In conclusion, while each type of interpersonal violence does bring with it some unique aspects, the common precursors to most forms of violence across the lifespan are childhood experiences with violence or serious family dysfunction. Exposure to violence is the best predictor of future violence exposure. This is because early exposure to violence leads to a cascading set of negative impacts on the person's environment development. Remember the pyramid. Many forms of interpersonal violence are interrelated across the lifespan. Johnny started as a victim of child abuse, but became a perpetrator of peer assault in school, dating violence, intimate partner violence, and he became a physically abusive parent. Katie was a victim throughout her life, but then her alcohol abuse led her to be a neglectful parent. And until she became more powerful than Johnny as an older adult, she finally began to let her anger out by victimizing him. To effectively decrease violence, we must help those who are currently being harmed, as well as those who are currently doing the harming.
Thank you very much, Pearl. Our next speaker is Susan O'Million, and she is an attorney, author, and motivational speaker who has advocated for over 40 years to end violence against women. She has worked as a sexual assault victim advocate and also represented domestic violence victims in divorce proceedings. With the death 23 years ago of her 19-year-old niece, Maggie, killed by her ex-boyfriend, Susan's work became more immediate and personal. She vowed to help women move on after abuse, as Maggie could not. Susan is now the originator and facilitator of My Avenging Angel workshops based on the idea that living well is the best revenge that have helped hundreds of women take the journey from victim to survivor to thriver. She has also facilitated intervention groups with male domestic violence offenders in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, and presented her work on thriving after trauma to female inmates in Pennsylvania and male inmates in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Thank you very much, Susan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katie. So good afternoon. I wanted to talk to you about my experience more personally, I think is the way to describe it, particularly as a trauma survivor. As Katie mentioned, my niece Maggie, I got a phone call in the middle of the night from my sister. She told me that my niece Maggie, who was a college student at the time, had been killed, shot and killed. And my first reaction was, how could this happen? It was kind of a shock, having done this work before Maggie's death, which was in 1999, for about 20 years. My reaction initially, although it didn't really make much sense, given that I knew a lot about the kinds of that victimization of domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse, was not really assigned to any particular family or social economic group or race or religious, whatever, but somehow it didn't seem to be that my family was ever going to be affected. Somehow my family, in my mind at that moment, was in the middle of the night, of course, which is always very confusing, that my family was the other and that I wouldn't be affected and my family wouldn't be affected. So I became a secondary victim of a crime, and I was now a homicide survivor, which is a survivor of someone who had been killed, usually a loved one, a family, a friend. So I want to talk a little bit about that experience and sort of adding it to what Pearl is talking about and kind of the different ways people can experience trauma and maybe some of the ways we can prevent this kind of violence from happening. As you can see, my niece was a beautiful, very bright 4.0 student. She wanted to go to law school. She had decided to study history in her undergraduate, and a musical athlete. So she was the kind of kid that was not, at least in most people's mind, would be a victim, perhaps, or at least somebody who could would be enough of a problem solver that could move through victimization. But that wasn't true. Next slide, Pearl. So here's some quick facts about Maggie that sort of underscore what happened to her and the kinds of issues that I think are still, although this is 20 years ago, are still fairly common, not only on college campuses, but across the board on domestic violence and sexual assault. So she was 19 years old. She was a sophomore in college. He was a 20-year-old junior. She had broken up with him. She had called him immature, and that he pushed the relationship too far, too fast. but he had never physically threatened her or ever assaulted her before he killed her. So that danger sign, what today we call them warning signs, we now talk to them more about recent days about red flags, was there, but she didn't really call him abusive, at least not to the people around her. After the breakup, he constantly called her, he emailed her. This is a very small campus, so that was not impossible to have a lot of contact with her, texted her friends, begging her to return. The manipulation was certainly there. Maggie, as I said, was a good problem solver. She thought she could solve this problem all by herself, mainly because she didn't see a lot of people on that campus who were going to help her with this. Remember, there was no physical danger, at least not in her mind. One night he invited her to come to see him in his dorm room. She did that regularly. She'd go there even while they were together to help him with some school papers. And I think, knowing my niece, she was going there to tell him one more time to leave her alone, and then that would be it. Next slide, Pearl. So what Maggie didn't know is that night that he had a gun. He had bought it about 10 days before from a gun shop. This is in Michigan, where you can, at that time, and probably still, you can get a hunting rifle pretty easily. There was no waiting period at the time. And his friends knew, at least they told the police afterwards, that he was suicidal that night. He was saying final things to him. But because he never hit her, his friends, or at least they didn't know about it, and Maggie didn't think there was much danger, so she went to see him. She walked into the room that night by herself, closed the door, and his friends saw that she had done that she was in the room with him. And of course, there was nobody who felt that was a dangerous situation. But there were signs of danger. The warning signs, the red flags. First of all, the refusal to accept the relationship being broken up. That's a really clear warning sign. I think, I don't know if he directly did this. I don't know what happened the last 10 minutes in the room. But another warning sign is when the perpetrator threatens to kill himself if the ex-partner doesn't come back. And my niece was a very empathetic person, so that might have been something that would pull her. He was obsessed and possessive of her. That was clear to all of her friends, to my family. My brother and sister-in-law were pleased that she had broken up with him. And like I said, remember, she called him immature, but not abusive or somebody she was afraid of. And I think ultimately his mind thinking that night was, if I couldn't have her, no one else could. And so he killed her and he killed himself. Next slide. Thanks, Pearl. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and then we'll come back to what I just talked about in terms of what Maggie didn't know and what could have prevented what happened that night. But I want to talk a little bit first about survivors of homicide. Now, remember, I was never thought I'd be in this category, although I had worked with victims for many years. So I knew kind of how victims react, but it was a really eye-opening experience. So as I said, a homicide survivor is someone who includes the family of the homicide victim. So it was parents, siblings, aunts and uncles. I have a very large, I'm a Polish American family member. We have a very large extended family, and other grandparents, great grandparents were involved in my family. So I think what we always thought, and I've heard this a lot from parents, that your child's going to outlive you. So that shock was really intense. And then there was Maggie's friends, her close friends, people she knew. She was a very gregarious, outgoing young woman. She had a lot of friends, co-workers, people that knew, neighbors. I've met some of the neighbors after Maggie was killed, and how devastated they were. Long-term neighbors, fellow students, teachers knew her and just knew her incredible potential. Immediate neighborhood, the surrounding community, and then the larger community within the state. This is the state of Michigan. And I've had people, refer to her case nationwide and global. She was murdered right after the Columbine case. Columbine was in I think April of 1999, Maggie was killed in October. So it's the beginning of the school shootings, although this wasn't a mass shooting, but it was sort of the same idea that there's a gun on the campus. Nobody knew about it. Nobody reported it, and somebody died. 2 people actually died that day. So what we faced as a family was shock and turmoil and guilt. I had a lot of guilt. I knew all about this. How come I couldn't save Maggie? Anger at how this had happened, angered the college for not having stuff in place that could have saved Maggie. Why didn't she think that asking for help was something she would get help on that campus? And then that need for revenge. And as in my introduction, I got my idea for the work is that I couldn't take him to court and in the typical way that the criminal justice system might allow some justice and revenge. So I got the idea of living well is the best revenge and how to move on from it. Post-traumatic stress, depression, and the 5 stages of guilt, of grief, I'm sorry, that I still move back and forth through. Today's a good day. I get to talk about this in a positive way, but there's ways that I trigger back to my anger, depression, and even denial, like this couldn't have really happened to my niece. Then, although this young man killed himself, we didn't have to directly deal with the court system and the prosecution, but dealing with the police and the media and the public opinion. People, well, why didn't you raise her this way? Or why didn't you do that? And some people would actually say that to your face, which was difficult and hard to believe. And then the need to cope with the loss. Holidays are still hard. I would always see Maggie at Christmas time for her birthday. She and I share a birthday. And what about forgiveness? I call it the F word in the homicide survivor community. I don't know that forgiveness is closure. I don't know. I have chosen to not get stuck in my anger about him. I've decided to move on. If that's forgiveness, then that's the way I define it. And finally, whatever is good and bad in a family or a marriage will come out in these kinds of stress. So there were some really great things about my family. We coalesced together, and there were some hard things. This brought up a lot of other traumas that some of which I didn't even know about in my family until this moment. So really trying to cope with that. And it's now been over 20 years, and we still sometimes, it's front and center sometimes. So it's not something that goes away. Next slide, Pearl. So the other thing I want to talk about is sort of some of the changes that I saw in terms of reducing dating violence, although this is certainly on college campuses, but it can be extrapolated to other schools environments, workplace environments, and then just domestic violence in general. Certainly we have learned, since I wrote this slide a couple of months ago, the gun violence issue has gotten even more excessive in this, in this country. As I said before, he got this gun pretty easily. The college had a zero gun possession policy that had just been put in place, but because nobody reported it, and the gun store owner, although he'd used a college dormitory address, the gun store owner did not feel a moral obligation to call the school. They would have had reasonable cause. They told us later, if the gun store owner had done that, they could have searched the room and found the gun, and this wouldn't have happened. But that was not a legal requirement of that gun store owner. More awareness and advocacy for the staff. Once again, why did people think this wouldn't happen on their campus? Why do they think they were in some kind of a bubble that wouldn't approach them? More training for teaching faculty, for counseling services. Campus police was a big issue on this. Why did Maggie not trust them to call them and get some help? She perceived that they would not do that based on some previous experiences. There weren't a lot of women on that police force at the time, so she didn't feel comfortable talking to the men who didn't seem to get what some of the other issues that she had called about were. Educating students, like I said, my niece was very bright. She got the idea that there were warning signs, but somehow she didn't associate it with what was going on. And she was a problem solver. She was going to figure this out. So more work at orientation, more teaching in relevant classes, health classes, women's studies classes, and posting it on the school websites. Many colleges now do that. And then also that it doesn't include just physical violence, but also verbal and emotional violence. That's really, and today we have a new, I wouldn't say a new word, a new concept, but a new word for it. which is coercive control, the kind of manipulation. He manipulated her into that room that night. He manipulated her through most of this relationship, and not only manipulated her into the relationship, but to continue to not to keep her hanging on so that maybe there was some chance that he could get her back. And then cultivating a campus culture of respect for women. This is a very good school and with very high intelligent students and reputable faculty. And I found it coming into this campus environment that there was not a lot of respect for women. There was a lot of men on that campus who had like, well, if Maggie would have just stayed with him, she'd still be alive today. Just had really no concept of what was going on and how difficult it was for women to deal with this. And so reviewing the student conduct policies, maybe establishing a no hit, no abuse line, and really, really doing a zero tolerance for violence, not just guns, but violence and abuse. And finally, many, many schools are working on bystander intervention techniques. And we've been talking about this lately with the gun violence issue that's been accelerating in our country. See something, say something. His friends knew that night he was not in good shape. Maggie knew that he was not in good shape, but she tried to go and help him. But her girlfriends knew that there was something going on in that relationship. So how do you feel comfortable and where can you report? And using the Title IX reporting channels. Next slide. So I want to wrap up with just talking a bit about the work I do today, inspired by my niece's murder. Maggie is one of those kids, if there was a problem or a situation, we talk about some of my cases that I was litigating as attorney when she was a kid. We have to do something about this, Aunt Susan, what she would tell me. So the idea that I wanted to do something about it, I knew I couldn't go back to crisis intervention work, although I had done that before, because I was now a secondary survivor of a trauma. Every woman in the shelter with Maggie, I couldn't emotionally do that. So I found something else I could do. So I do these workshops, they're free and virtual right now in the wonderfulness of Zoom. And I'm helping women move on, and it's been very successful. That the idea that we can do more than just survive. Maggie couldn't survive, so I'm helping other women move on to do that. I think what we need to understand is there's a healing process here, that there are stages of recovery, and that we can get to what I've now learned, because I'm not a clinical person, what's been identified as post-traumatic growth. And that's what I've learned, is that I couldn't change the trauma that happened, the violence that happened in my family, but I can show the sense of growth. And that's really what I've been able to go to. And the work that I do today really promotes that kind of feeling. So Maggie would, I think, approve of that and feel like there's something good that came out of her experience. I have now joined a club of survivors of homicide, a club that I did not want to join, but I have met a lot of survivors of homicide, and that's what many of them tell me: find something good to do, something that moves you forward. And you see that a lot more recently, actually. Certainly the Parkland students, the gun violence mass shooting down in Florida, they moved into it pretty fast. It's hard to do, it's hard to see, but the idea that trauma can be something that you can move through, and also that you can find something that will move you forward in doing something good and prosperous in honor of the kind of victim, certainly my niece's victims, but it doesn't mean you won't be pulled back into it. And that's really the journey that I've been on, victim to survivor to thriver. I'm going to take a breath. Thank you. I put my contact information and my website. It's also up here and I have this short video about Maggie and some of the women that have come through my workshops. What's really important to me is that these women they are moving along, and they actually describe their journey much better than I can. But I think it's really important in thinking about how we not only prevent violence, but intervene in violence, and also help people to move forward, that there is a life after, there is possibility and growth. You didn't want this to happen to you, but it did. And so how do we make that be what I believe is living well is the best revenge? Thank you so much.
Susan, are you going to play the video or are you wrapped up?
No, I'm good. I just wanted to let people know there is a video, but yes,
And to
thank you.
watch it, yes, and you did get a comment just stating you're an inspiration. Thank you
Oh,
for
thank you. I
sharing.
saw that.
My deepest sympathies for your loss and trauma you've
Thank you.
experienced.
Thank you so much. People have been so kind about that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And also we have some conversation going on about men stopping violence and different roles in campuses and things. So I think we'll
Yes.
probably have a lively discussion towards
Yes,
the
that's
end.
a topic I'd love to talk about. Absolutely.
Mhm. So our next two wonderful speakers will be speaking together and they will be bouncing off each other is my understanding. So we have Megan Garza is a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified trauma care supervisor, and American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists board approved supervisor with 20 years of experience in the mental health violence against women field. She is a graduate of Pepperdine University with a master's degree in clinical psychology and marriage and family therapy, and University of Missouri St. Louis with a second master's degree in psychology. One just wasn't enough, was it, Megan? She is co-owner and therapist at Healing Reflections Therapy, Diversity, Trauma, and Wellness Services in St. Louis, Missouri. She is on the advisory board of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence and is former president of the St. Louis Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Megan has spoken at national conferences on sexual trauma and PTSD and has published and edited peer-reviewed research in the area of trauma-informed care and sexual abuse. And our other speaker, Karen Rich, teaches LCSW PhD, teaches and researches in the area of secondary victimization, rape, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and institutional responses to trauma. Her research has focused on police responses to rape victims, interdisciplinary responses to sexual assault, interpersonal violence against people with disabilities, and secondary victims of campus rape. She is active on several trauma-related boards, conference planning groups, and intervention teams on the international, national, and local levels. She is pleased to be a longstanding member of MPEIV's board and their practice action team. Thank you very much, Megan and Karen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie. Well, I'm so happy to be here and talking with you today about trauma, a hard topic, but it's really important. And part of why we want to address this is talking about why does addressing past trauma even matter? A lot of my clients I see as a trauma therapist, a lot of people initially come in saying to me like, I'm not sure I even need to be here. Like, what's the point? And I think I should just kind of leave the past in the past. And that's a lot of the message that they get from their family members. Let's not uncover this stuff. You just need to move on. You just need to get over it. And for some survivors, that's actually probably one of the most insulting and hurtful things that you can say to them is to just get over it. Part of the reason why addressing the past matters, addressing past trauma matters, is because of some of the things that what Pearl referenced earlier was what we understand about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. What happened in the past is present. It matters today. We know that individuals who, if you came from a background where you had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, the likelihood of you living 20 years less it's very much a possibility because it impacts so much of other health risk factors. So we know that we really need to be able to address individuals' health early on. So being able to pay attention to what's going on with someone's past trauma, how it creates risk factors across virtually all health domains that they have been able to measure. It's critically important for us to pay attention to what is happening to someone today based on what's happened in the past. In addition to that, we know that there's a generational impact of trauma. So very often, people in past generations, your past family members, your ancestors may have experienced a lot of trauma in their background. And we know that the past is often very present in what current current survivors of those past traumas are carrying around with them. There is a past burden of that intergenerational trauma. We know that there's recent studies on epigenetics that have looked at the impact of trauma on Holocaust survivors and survivors of Dutch famine and survivors of racial discrimination, and how it changes how past trauma from one generation changes how genes are expressed, which genes get turned on and which genes get turned off, the expression of certain genes based on past trauma. So the past is present. And sometimes the stories, the social aspect, there are different things that impact how individuals are carrying around those past burdens and the hurts that need to be addressed today, the social changes that we need to address today. We also know that healing is also not time limited. So sometimes people want to rush survivors through their healing process, that, like, just get over it. It's not a big deal. But just because something happened 6 days ago, 6 months ago, 6 years ago, or 60 years ago, a person may suddenly be re-experiencing those symptoms as though it is current day. They may be re-triggered. They may continue to re-experience those things. Healing is not time limited, and it's not for anyone else to determine when or how long you should heal. Healing takes time, and it works on its own timeline. Many of the survivors that I see as a trauma therapist, they're not coming in until about, very often not until 20 or 30 years until after their initial trauma. So giving people the time to address their trauma as they see fit, as they are ready. We can go on to the next slide, and we'll let Karen talk a little bit more about some of this.
Okay, so what do we mean when we say trauma? Many people use the word lightly. People may use the word to describe minor incidents or major incidents, but in general, when we look at the DSM, trauma is an experience that makes a person fear for their life or the life of a loved one, and which overwhelms their coping capacities. So when I was younger, I used to hear the expression nervous breakdown. You would hear that somebody had a nervous breakdown. This is sort of what is meant by a traumatizing experience, where somebody literally is unable to cope and maybe reverting into a childlike state or just completely shutting down. So these are very severe incidents. That said, something that might be severe to one person might not be severe to another person. So what determines what is traumatic is very, very individual. And it has to do with one's coping history, one's genetics, one's support system, etc. Characteristics of a traumatic reaction include rumination, going over and over the event in one's mind, often blaming oneself, but trying to figure out what went wrong and what could I have done differently, to the point of exhaustion. Flashbacks of the experience can take the form of nightmares, or even during the day, being triggered by something in the environment that brings one right back into the traumatic situation, even for a moment. And these can be unexpected and can completely overtake people, leading some people to actually become agoraphobic or just afraid to leave the house, because they may encounter some random trigger and lose control of their body, mind, and emotions. Emotional dysregulation in general is characteristic as a response to trauma, where people have very extreme reactions that alternate with dissociation, which means absolute emotional deadness and leaving one's body. So to the person suffering from trauma, one has become irrational, and people often say, what's happened to me? I've lost my mind, because they don't necessarily associate the symptoms with the trauma. Many times people have a memory impairment problem, so that when they go and report, let's say, a crime to the police, They can't remember the sequence of events, or they can't remember particulars, because the mind is also dissociating even while it's trying to piece together what happened. And this causes some trauma survivors to struggle with being disbelieved, because they don't sound as credible as they would if they didn't have PTSD, or if they weren't experiencing a traumatic reaction. So part of what happens is there's a gap between the experience that the trauma survivor is having and the support that they receive. So people may not offer the kind of support that the person needs because they misjudge the trauma survivor and they don't really understand what's happening. Sarah Ullman did a study on trauma and how it leads to post-traumatic stress disorder and what are the predictors of it becoming actual full-blown PTSD. And what she found was one of the primary variables is whether or not the person received adequate emotional support from loved ones and also service providers. So we, as service providers, can make a difference in terms of whether a trauma survivor actually goes on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So another thing you'll often see with people who have experienced trauma is self-harm. Sometimes this helps to regulate the emotions of the survivor, to help them break out of a dissociative episode, or just to feel something, or sometimes even to punish themselves for what they feel was something that was their fault. Overeating and other types of addictions can also happen so that the person can try to modulate the emotional dysregulation that they're feeling in the only way that they know how. And this is much more likely when people are not talking about what happened. So they're instead acting it out in various ways. And another key factor in trauma is the secondary survivors. And it's very interesting. Susan O'Million just described her experience as the secondary survivor of murder, but this can happen to people whose loved ones have been raped, bullied, victims of domestic violence. If you're very, very close to a trauma survivor, you can take on some of the qualities of post-traumatic stress from association with them, which is why secondary survivors often need a lot of help themselves. And even social workers and psychologists and people who characteristically interact with trauma survivors throughout the course of a day, a week, a month, years, they can develop something called vicarious trauma, where they also experience trauma-related symptoms and begin to distrust others and just think of the world as a very, very unsafe place because they're so bombarded with hearing about experiences that most people do not want to hear about. And it affects their worldview sometimes. And that's why self-care is just so important. What you see in this slide is a list of potential sources of traumatic reactions. I did mention car accidents and things of that nature, but of course those also can create traumatic reactions. Next slide. So these are some of the indicators that a loved one that you may be involved with is having a traumatic reaction. Sudden changes in behavior, usually obviously in a negative direction. Sudden fearfulness, agoraphobia, regressive behavior, especially in children. They act like they're very young compared to their true age. People become jumpy. They may need to sit near a door all the time because they're always looking to escape. They may not want to be touched. They may not be able to disrobe, even to the point of putting on a bathing suit. They may feel triggered by going to the beach where they see maybe children that are half clothed because they start imagining those children being abused. You know, there's so many different symptoms that somebody may be experiencing a traumatic reaction. But mainly what you're seeing is emotional dysregulation, where the person's up and down and on and off and all over the place. And has extreme changes in their behavior from before they've had this experience. Next slide. So trauma-informed care includes a lot, but it's basically a way to interface with somebody who's coming to you for help, who has been traumatized, and also to set up your agency in such a way that it's hospitable to people who might be traumatized. So if you work in a homeless shelter, you can pretty much assume that many of the people that are going to come in to use your services have been victims of trauma, similar to a domestic violence shelter. Medical clinics will often see people who have been beaten and abused. So many agencies, many organizations that provide social services and medical services and criminal justice services are agencies where they will see a lot of trauma survivors. We don't often like to think about it, but prisons also contain a number of trauma survivors. But to try to create an environment that is not re-traumatizing people is very important. So for example, you want to look around and see what are the things in the environment that exist that could be triggers to somebody who had experienced trauma. Many people, when they go to the doctor, they're asked to take their clothes off. This could be something that's incredibly triggering to somebody who has been sexually abused. And a large number of sexual abuse survivors go into medical offices, right? And so it needs to be thought through very carefully. What are the things about the way we do business here that could be triggering, and can we modify these in response to another person's request, or just even preemptively to create an atmosphere that's less likely to cause this person to want to leave? So many people complain that service recipients don't follow through. They don't come back a second time. They leave early. They're non-compliant, right, with treatment recommendations. A lot of these people that are non-compliant are actually triggered by the service environment, and the reason they don't come back is because they are experiencing traumatic reactions to their service providers or the setting. So looking around for things that could be triggering, training all staff and supervising all staff on the signs of somebody possibly being triggered and how to talk people down and de-escalate them when they see these signs. Giving people as many choices as possible. You can't always let a client choose everything, but sometimes you can let them make choices. For example, regarding the gender of the service provider, where that's possible. Somebody might want to speak to a female police officer after they were sexually assaulted. Talking to somebody who has the same cultural background as you, if that's possible. Some people are looking for a particular type of provider and are very triggered by other people. So trying to accommodate that, trying to accommodate the type of treatment that you're providing to the person, if there are options, providing a list of choices and asking the person, what would you prefer? The time and the place of treatment can be modified. When it comes to taking police reports, asking the person, what setting would you be most comfortable in making this police report? What time of day, what kind of person would you most like to speak to regarding this incident? And if that's not possible, that's okay, but trying to make the most modifications that are possible. Respecting the person's confidentiality. We're supposed to do that anyway, but that's particularly important with a trauma survivor. And an individualized treatment approach in general, asking the person what specifically they would need in order to feel most safe within the environment, and not just assuming that one size fits all. So part of this whole process involves cultural competency, because different cultural groups have different ideas about what constitutes trauma, what constitutes healing, what they expect from let's say a medical practitioner. And it's important to consider that when providing trauma-informed services. Asking people, what about the service you received today was helpful? And what about the service you received today, felt uncomfortable for you? So in other words, collecting feedback from the client population. Having some clients on boards, members of the service population on boards who can look around and talk about what are some things that could be done to make this place more hospitable to the population. And also another very important aspect of the work is providing services to secondary survivors. So these people are often overlooked. So where there's been a sexual assault, often services are provided to the survivor, but not, let's say, the partner or the husband or the girlfriend of the survivor, right? And those people are going to be influential in helping that individual client heal. So trauma-informed care involves so much, and yet all of it is just common sense when you think about somebody in the perspective of a survivor feeling vulnerable, going into an institution where they may feel that they're surrendering control, and may feel victimized by the very process of asking for help or receiving the kind of help they're being given. Well, thank you for your time.
So now that begs the question, thank you, Karen. Well, okay, so we've got these problems that we're facing, and we know so many people have experienced trauma or vicarious trauma, or their loved ones have experienced trauma. So how do we help? What can we do? So if we're talking about trying to help someone, maybe someone else, or it could be for yourself, but if you're trying to help somebody else, you could offer them a glass of water to help them regulate their body. Ice water is really good for hitting that vagus nerve. So it's really good, even whether you want to drink that water or you want to splash some cold water on your face. Sometimes even submerging your hand in ice water can be re-regulating. Just kind of helps bring people back to the present here in this moment in time, rather than be distracted and go someplace else. But it also helps re-regulate that vagus nerve. You can also help practice deep breathing with the person. So there are a lot of really helpful apps right now. You can like there's like the Calm app and mindfulness apps, and not trying to promote anything, but there are lots of different things that I know clients use and friends use, that help them coach them through different breathing exercises. So when you're going to do deep breathing, we want you to do what we call deep diaphragm breathing or belly breathing. So it's, if you put one hand here on your chest and another here on your belly, if you take a deep breath right down into your belly where you have the hand on your belly that moves, but this top hand doesn't. That is an example of deep breathing, and you do multiple sets of that, just slow inhale and exhalations. And you can do that in ways of which you have square breathing, where you breathe in to a count of 5, hold for a count of 5, exhale to a count of 5, hold, and hold again for a count of 5, inhale to a count of 5. And so you do that in kind of in the shape of a square, and you're visualizing it at the same time. So there are different ways. There are lots of different kinds of visualization techniques that you can do along with the breathing, but breathing is a really nice way of trying to help reset what's going on internally. You also have things, you also have other things that can help a person stay in the present moment. Where with therapists, a lot of times we recommend people use their 5 senses. So using things that you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. So just notice what's around in the room. So to help ground you, what do you notice in the room around you? Notice the lights. Notice the clouds in the sky. Notice how your feet feel on the ground, and kind of scrunch your toes in your shoes. Notice how that feels. Notice how your buns feel, on the chair underneath you. Kind of feel your hands on the chair, and notice the smoothness of maybe the seat, or the roughness of the material. Notice the sounds that are going on in the room, or notice any smells. Just things that kind of help bring a person back to this very present moment, instead of getting caught up in maybe a flashback back, or those intrusive thoughts that take them back to that unpleasant memory in the past. You also want to help to just listen without judging. So you're going to just take in those experiences and just accept what they're saying, but you're not going to try to judge them. So you're going to have an open, accepting environment without asking a lot of questions. A lot of times survivors will tell you that they feel like telling somebody something feels like they're at an inquisition, because most people, when they hear something terrible, the first thing they want to do, they don't know how to respond, so they start asking a lot of questions, and they're trying to make sense of it. But so a lot of times, well, why were you there? What were you wearing? What happened? Why? And a lot of those why questions are perceived as like, like a gut, like a knife to the gut. They're just so painful. So just eliminate why questions from your vocabulary is a really, really important recommendation. Just leave room for them to tell you their story and bear witness to their pain. Like, I'm sorry that happened. How can I help? Like that's really awful. Like, I can't imagine. Just sit and be present. That's really most of what they need. Can I take you somewhere? What are you needing from me in the moment? Try to avoid giving advice unless the person is asking for it. It can be really frustrating when you're just wanting someone to hear you out, and they're telling you what you need to do. You need to go to the police. You need to go do this. You need to go do this. That might not be what they're needing right in that moment. Just hear that person out. You can also, you can also tell them they didn't deserve what happened to them. That's I think that's a very powerful message. That's an awful thing, and you didn't deserve that. Give that person room to talk. Give them space to talk if they want to, and thank them so much for their willingness to share. That I appreciate, like that you have enough trust in me to share something like that. You can help get them to a safe space if that helps. So you can help them set up doctor's appointments with lawyers, advocates, therapists. Just give them the resources and refer them on to the help that they might need, and offer them ideas for coping skills. And do the same thing for yourself. You might need that additional help and resources for yourself for your indirect trauma, because experiencing that along with someone else and hearing those stories or just being witness to it can be really, really distressing. And you as a helper might need a lot of assistance too. Next slide, please. So where can you go to get help? So there are local resources in Pennsylvania. This how to get help link can link you to some resources. You have places like the National Suicide Prevention Hotline that has resources. You have that when someone is in crisis. You have RAIN.org, which is a phenomenal resource for individuals who have experienced sexual assault. That it's a little bit hidden on the website, but if you search through it, you can find different local resources for every state, for what you need in your local community. Very, very helpful. You have a resource for Valley Against Sex Trafficking. National Center for PTSD has great videos, great resources on psychoeducation about post-traumatic stress disorder, which may result when someone has experienced extreme stress and trauma. They have great videos on different examples of treatments and medications that might be recommended for individuals, and specific medications that probably shouldn't be used. And there's just great information for helping people kind of understand what trauma might look like and how they can get help. Similarly, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a wealth of information. They have toolkits. They have information both for providers and for survivors and for their families on how to get help, particularly for children who've experienced trauma in all kinds of different trauma. So it's a wonderful resource. Next slide, please. So in talking about, how do we prevent trauma? And this is kind of difficult. So we have trauma in talking about preventing trauma like in the moment, and then there's talking about preventing trauma in terms of the after effects of trauma. So in terms of preventing the immediate trauma from happening, the crisis, so first off, we encourage you to just listen to your gut, watch for warning signs, warning signs of danger. A lot of times, people can, people get in the habit of just kind of like, talking themselves out, like, I'm just being silly, but really one of our greatest tools for being able to protect ourselves is by listening to our body, listening to those signs. And and that's one of the things where usually after something has happened, a lot of times people, when they have that, sort of 2020 way of looking back, they often say, like, I felt something fun. I felt uncomfortable. There was something about that felt weird. That's some of those things that we're talking about. Gavin DeBecker talked a little bit about this concept in this book called The Gift of Fear. And that's a little bit what he's talking about, is talking about this sort of these warning signs, or some, I think he calls them satellites in his book. You can also put up no hit zones, put up signs for no hit zones. So how we have no smoking signs. Susan talked about this in her presentation a little bit too. But we're used to seeing no smoking signs up in waiting rooms everywhere. But what if we started to adopt this notion of no hit zones? So instead of, if you're sitting in a hospital waiting room and you see somebody spanking or hitting another child, or hitting their supposed loved one, that kind of thing can be really triggering and distressing and upsetting for other people who are sitting in the waiting room, in addition to it being traumatizing for the person who is experiencing it. So the idea of a no hit zone can be very protective and create this idea of more of a safe place, and can help maybe change the culture of what we're seeing. So that's another idea of what we can start to do to try to change how we're talking about things. We also have this idea of bystander intervention. So green dot programs are really great for this idea of how do we intervene if something is happening. If you see something, say something. So there are ways, if you're seeing something happening that you're worried about, like, here's this is sort of like a red flag, you're worried about what's happening with someone, maybe you might be able to intervene a little bit more indirectly. So maybe approaching that person and just being like, excuse me, can I ask for directions? Do you know which way the bathroom is? Do you know which way the 7-Eleven is? Something that breaks that person's concentration from that moment and focuses on something else, away from that anger and aggression that they might be pointing at somebody. So something that shifts it into a more neutral space and gets them out of that headspace. So you can do that. You can do that in certain ways. Looking into more green dot resources can also help you, and green dot trainings can also help you find more resources on bystander interventions. In terms of post-trauma, we can look at so in the wake of like the recent mass shootings, sometimes hearing about all this stuff can be so overwhelming. So sometimes the best self-care that we can do is, it might be avoiding triggering social media content. Sometimes that is just too much for anyone, to be able to take. Sometimes turning off social media, unplugging, unfollowing, just taking a pause for a little while, so that it feels safer. Also, we encourage people to just, get help from other people, contact other people. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. We often encourage survivors to tell and keep telling until you get the appropriate response. It's not unusual for people to not get the kind of response that they are hoping for when when they first talk about a trauma, when they first talk about things, that they don't get the correct response from someone. So we very oftentimes encourage people to just keep telling. If that person didn't give you the right response, go to the next person. If that person doesn't respond appropriately, go to the next person, because you need support. The number one predictor of how well people do in the long run after trauma is their level of social support. So we need people to get good social support after their trauma. Things that can help you take care of yourself. You can practice yoga and meditation and some of that deep breathing. Make sure to get a really good night's sleep. Sleep is our fuel. Eating is our fuel. So making sure that we're taking care of our body. Do what you can do to try to find humor and laughter. I often recommend clients listen to some comedians on YouTube, or watching funny cat videos or dog videos, something that lightens the mood. Connect with positive relationships and people that really help enliven you and charge your battery back up rather than deplete it. Establish a place of safety. After trauma, people usually want to go, they just want to be safe. So find a place that you feel safe, and be around those individuals that help you feel safe. And we have future presentations that are going to be talking more about how we can address more about resilience factors. So even though a person may be impacted by trauma, may be impacted by generational trauma, may be impacted by current trauma, there are other things that we can do that a person may also have protective factors. They may have resilience factors. They may have post-traumatic growth, ways that just because a person has experienced trauma doesn't mean that they cannot really grow and flourish. It doesn't always have to be the bad stuff, but we do want to recognize that from a trauma-informed perspective, that the hurt can be impactful, and we need to recognize that pain in order to help people move forward beyond it. So recognize the pain first, and then we can grow forward. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Katie for our next person to introduce. Thank you.
Someday my video will come back on. Thank you so much, Megan and Karen, for that wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Joyce Thomas. She is an RN, and you have many titles after your name that I probably don't know the correct acronym to describe, Joyce. My apologies for that. But she is an international and national pioneer in child welfare, victimization of children, and domestic violence. Joyce is the president and CEO and co-founder of the Center for Child Protection and Family Support in Washington, D.C., and director of Children and Family Institutes in Silver Spring, Maryland. She is providing leadership, both organizations providing leadership for quality services to children and families. She is also on the board of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence, and a wonderful and amazing individual. So without further ado, Joyce, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katie. And everyone asks all of those credentials. As a professional nurse, the opportunities to move in different directions sometimes makes it important to really know how to describe and how that person is involved in service delivery. So I am so happy to be here, and you've received a lot of very interesting information that can be utilized to help you address issues of trauma, and also information that leaves you with what can you do. And I'm going to continue along that line. My presentation is going to focus on issues of public policies, particularly to promote resilience and to practice action steps for preventing violence in the future. Particularly in the lives of children, and youth and the entire family. The focus is on interpersonal violence against children, and the trauma is also on issues related to trauma-informed services, which is the goal really for helping to reduce further trauma and also to improve resilience and to promote prevention in the future.
Joyce, I'm sorry to interrupt real quick. Could you lower your camera just a touch? We're missing there we go. Perfect. Thank you. We were just getting chopped off a little bit at the end.
Well, I can't see my picture at all, so I don't know. So
well, there. Perfect now. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Public policy really is a focus on many things, and it could be institutionalized to involve an agency, and certainly it could be addressing all kinds of worldwide problems. And it really kind of is a guided concept to help us look at programs and to look at ways that we can work as a group. Typically by government entities, it's a response to some kind of social issue, which may include laws and rules and regulations, policies and procedures in an organization, and even legal procedures that may occur. Next slide, please. So policies are really a very broad area, and no one person can really write a policy because you really need to have input from others. When a person singularly tries to develop a policy, the circumstances are such that they may only be reflecting their own perspective, and policies should be broad enough to reflect a broad perspective. And we see this really in our political environments where there's at least attempts at compromise, so that whatever policy is developed, which may lead into legislation and regulations, that it really does cover a broad spectrum of the environment. Interpersonal violence against children, as we know and have heard, is very traumatic. And it really requires all systems who are dealing with families, children, individual people to be trauma informed. And this trauma informed, as was discussed by Katie and Megan, really help us to understand what we can do. Next slide, please. So let's look at some systems. Let's look at some of the things that could be done. Certainly in terms of systems intervention, one of the comments in the chat was talking about the notion of systemic abuse. There's many terms for that. It could be systemic racism, it could be systemic bias, but we're talking about an entire system. And when we look at the healthcare system, the policies really much focus on mitigating, which is changing the effects of trauma and effects of the adverse childhood experiences, as well as really trying to help individuals and departments to really focus on prevention and prevention efforts. Research documents that trauma of abuse and neglect really has implications on both short-term and long-term mental health well-being. Scientific evidence documents that biological and psychological trauma are seen in children's behavior. So it's not always a physical injury, but their behavior, their social relationships, their emotions. We've heard this through our prior speakers addressing situations that really have occurred in early childhood that really provoke and promote trauma. Early childhood exposure could be to toxic stress, and this toxic stress can last over a lifetime. So it's important that we changes in our structure to really kind of neutralize and improve and enhance our own immune system. Reducing toxic stress should also include providing services and beginning to look at prevention and reducing extreme stress. So we're talking about the individual, but we're also talking about the system. And these systems vary from the healthcare system to other systems. The goal of the trauma-informed system is to make sure that every person in that system recognizes how to intervene with trauma to avoid things that could trigger escalation of the problem. Next slide, please. So identifying policies that are designed to promote trauma-informed care is certainly well needed in our school systems. Again, the school is an environment that should be safe, and certainly the recent school shootings and the school shootings of the past have been fraught with many gaps in knowledge and understanding, and gaps in procedures, gaps in training, which have made the situation repeat itself over and over again. Certainly, we can look at the issues of guns. We can look at the issues of outside forces that really kind of promote such unfortunate violent acts against the schools. But the school system itself must become more trauma-informed. It really has been heavily debated today as to what that should look like. But if each person really understands the mechanisms of trauma and tries to reduce that by focusing on the individuals, we may have a more improved system. Certainly, we know that all of these policies and procedures are developed by individuals. So reducing toxic stress should include strategies for prevention, reducing extreme stress, and again, building resilience so that these situations do not occur. In schools, you have the opportunity for programs specifically to young people, mentoring programs, after-school programs, opportunities for students to get awards and recognitions, opportunities for parents and students and teachers to come together. These are all ways of really bringing together communication that, in fact, will promote an environment that is user-friendly and one that recognizes that the schools are not in isolation of all the other systems, that the schools have a responsibility, and the school policies, some were mentioned earlier, particularly in terms of universities and colleges and dealing with dating violence and how to proceed, who to talk to, what kinds of opportunities there are for both victims and victim families to get support from the schools. And these are all should be based on policies that are developed. So that's going to be the guideline for where we move. Next slide, please. Not only is there the healthcare system and the school system, but certainly there is the law enforcement system. Policies that promote trauma-informed policing can reduce re-victimization and vulnerability of individuals. Obviously, these policies must be able to serve justice and also engage citizens for positive results. But it doesn't mean that, the police officer cannot move in a direction of being trauma-informed. We certainly have had some overwhelming cases of situations where the law enforcement system, which has responded to an initial call for help, have made the situation significantly worse by not even thinking about the whole notion of trauma-informed policing, community policing, knowing the environment, knowing the culture, recognizing when to intervene and how to intervene in a way that to avoid further trauma and triggers that could escalate into something overwhelming. In all the conversations that are being said about, I rarely hear police departments talk about trauma-informed policing. And there's really just a landmark of information available from programs like the ones they have in Connecticut, where they have law enforcement and mental health people going out on calls that really present themselves as a mental health challenge. And with the intervention of a therapist or a clinician who is trained and qualified to really work with clients that may be under severe mental health stress, they are seeing reductions in physical harm, reduction in using additional restraints, and also trying to prevent triggering of the reaction and overreaction of that client. So we must really still advocate for trauma-informed policing and to identify ways of bringing that into all communities. Next slide, please. Not only are we, again, we're talking about systems and we're talking about systemic interventions through policies, and each person has an opportunity to influence policies. It's not an easy thing because it takes a lot of time, a lot of meetings, a lot of clarification. It requires some compromise, some recognition of the problem. But we also know even prosecutors need a basic understanding of trauma and how it affects individuals to be better able to serve the accused and the victims of crime in a humane way. There was a discussion of focusing too much on the victims and not focusing on the perpetrators. We know that the law enforcement system and the court system is designed to hold perpetrators accountable. It's unfortunate that we don't know as much about the systems within the law enforcement area that focuses on trauma, but accountability is an important thing, and because it helps alleviate some of the continued feeling of victimization by individuals who have experienced it or members of their families. Again, these policies need to provide guidance for prosecutors to assist them to incorporate trauma-informed best practices into their work. And this would enhance the need of crime victim services, working more with witnesses, bystanders, people accused of crime, and the entire community. A lot of the issues of this focus in some of the areas of social justice. And that's another whole concept of intervention that is designed to reduce the unfortunate realities of intensified trauma and toxic trauma. Next slide, please. So how does this affect the everyday person? We can't just walk into the hospital and look at policy. We would expect the persons in the hospital, in the management level, in the staff level, in every level, to sit down and look at the policies that the impact on hospitals in terms of how to deal with people when they're out of control. Policies related to no spanking zones in the hospital, and particularly in waiting room areas that have been pointed out. But above and beyond these institutions is the community itself, the everyday citizen who has many, many, many needs. And these policies that address trauma, particularly of child abuse and neglect, should intersect with that individual community's culture, their history, their racial background, their gender and their sexual preference, as well as their location and their language. So it has to be broad enough to incorporate all of these factors. At the same time, it has to be drilled down so that this policy can reflect to reduce the traumas that exist in these communities. We need to revise policies. Many times there are policies in place and they need to be revised in order to be more effective as trauma-informed approaches. Many times the policies are out of sync with what is currently going on, both administrative staff, clinical staff, to make sure that these policies are updated and that they do reflect the cultural variations that may exist by individuals. They also need to take a closer look at what guidelines and protocols that promote communication, cooperation, to assure a cross-section of individual thoughts arising into the trauma-informed care. This will really promote safety, physical safety, social and emotional working setting for all employees. And certainly we should hire a workforce that embodies the values of trauma-informed care. I remember going through a tour in a hospital, and we went through the operating room section, and we were looking at the procedures that they were using to make the operating room and the whole process of surgery more accepting to the clients that come in. There's certainly many, many safety factors involved, making sure you have the right client, making sure you're addressing the right area of the body that you're going to do the surgery on. And I simply asked, what are your trauma-informed policies and procedures in this OR? And I was surprised that many people today, still professionals in a number of areas, are not familiar. They always seem to think it's a mental health issue, and the mental health people can handle it alone. Again, this is the conversation that needs to be held in our communities and in our procedures, because oftentimes it is not likely that one discipline can handle all of this. So we really need to make sure we have systems involved, and those systems, the big ones we've talked about, but then there's the system of the family itself, where parenting and parent education all falls into an area where we're kind of trying to reduce trauma. So let's talk about the community. Next slide, please. We really need to get people together, people who can communicate, can facilitate conversations about what is happening in their community, what is missing in their community. I have spent the large part of my career as a community service provider. So I am very familiar with the traumas that really just everyday families are experiencing. Also the mental health traumas, but the policies that promote public awareness and getting information to people is what we need to focus on the most. Being aware, educating the public, getting help to create a safer, healthier environment, making sure that these policies are going to be observed and recognized, and then begin to build the kind of resilience that is necessary to help that community grow even further. Next slide, please. So individuals and communities really must demonstrate an active role to ensure that the allocation of resources for public policies are in place. You can't create policies in a vacuum that are not going anywhere. And the loudest squeaky wheel sometimes gets the prize, as they say. And so it's important that there is constant, frequent verbalization of what is needed to promote trauma-informed care in a given jurisdiction. This might mean meeting with city council members or state legislators, or even high up into the state governor in terms of administrative needs. Each citizen, I mean, the simplest right that each citizen has is to vote, and to vote in the people who are likely to promote the kinds of public policies that are reflective of their interests and their needs. We talked about this on several occasions, but symptoms of toxic stress generally emerge in a school. So those schools should have programs that are accessible for children and youth. And policymakers should gather information and review these informations to determine the best practices for school behavior, after school programs, extra learning and mentoring opportunity. Determine the benefits of the program. It is related to making sure that there are resources there and that there are parents involved. All of this flows into the concept of policy making. Building partnerships between the mental health and the school system is an excellent way of developing the needs of children and really key strategies to improve learning as well as academic performance. You want to create a plan, track these children with the intent of providing early identification of problems, as was pointed out in the vignette that was discussed earlier about Katie and Johnny. We saw Katie and Johnny's behavior go through a lifetime of various levels of victimization, perpetration, all these aspects. And somewhere along the way, with the proper kind of support, these individuals could have had a different trajectory. Building and creating a plan, tracking students with the intent of providing early identification and treatment of trauma with a long-term outcome goal of really reducing the risk that these children will end up in the juvenile justice system. These are the things that when we talk about prevention and when we talk about policies, we're really looking at the bigger picture, which is really trying to help individuals have a more stabilized and pleasant lifestyle. Even though things happen, they'll know a more effective way to address it. Policies that support training, awareness that adverse childhood experiences on trauma impacts these children in very, very critical ways and increases their vulnerability and increases their inability to really know what to do and how to do. The same would apply when we add trauma-informed policing. Central to the understanding of the ACE study is the notion that toxic trauma is not beneficial to individuals. This should be built into training for law enforcement, and this should be built into programs and services in schools, and the communities should be able to assess whether or not these opportunities for learning about trauma are available in the policies in these institutions. Assessing the risk of maltreatment or criminal offenses is very complex and is not really easy to do by one person. But I think with groups of individuals, I know that in each state of this country, including Pennsylvania, there are citizen review panels. And these panels are designed to recognize that citizens have a voice, and they should have a voice in what is going on. Next slide, please. So I've tried to walk through the issues of policies and policy formation as it relates to trauma-informed care and how we can use our knowledge about adverse childhood experiences to begin to inform systems on how to provide improved services for all citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. At this time, Pearl, I believe we are moving to the discussions. We did you want to go on to the case vignettes yet? Or we did have only one question really has come in at this point, if we wanted to answer that now, or.
I think that's a good idea. Let's answer that one question and then go into the scenario.
I answered this, but I thought it was a question that would also be interesting for you as a group to answer. Why don't we focus on perpetration as much as we focus on victimization? If there were no perpetrators, there wouldn't be victims. Men need a safe forum where they can talk about the issues they face, such as rejection, abandonment, sexual abuse, etc. So just curious on kind of your take on that. I responded from the perpetration side because that's the primary area of my work, is with perpetrators or those who have harmed. But I'd love to kind of hear some of your other perspectives on that.
I'd like to say that having also, let me turn my video back on here.
Mm-hmm.
Having worked both with victims for many years, and then after Maggie's death, I did about 15 years doing offender groups, mostly psychoeducational groups. I totally agree with with the question. And I've also done work with male inmates in 2 state prisons in the Northeast here, and the trauma histories of these men is, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And not that that justified what they did, in many cases murder, not only of their partner, wife, stepfather who was abusing their mother, but it's stunning. And I mean, this is where people go, particularly these men, where this, when the system fails them completely. So I think that's a real issue. I found one of the reasons why I don't do psychoeducational groups anymore with male domestic violence offenders, although I was working at a fairly low level of perpetration, usually misdemeanors, felonies for hitting, slapping, maybe some strangulation. I wasn't hitting the higher levels. But because we weren't addressing the trauma histories of these young men. And they were actually asking for that kind of help. And these programs were free to them because they had been adjudicated through the court system and were on probation. But what they really needed was individual trauma therapy. Not that that was the answer, but they even figured it out. With rare exception, unless you really begged and pleaded the probation officer, which I did sometimes, that they would not get individual counseling paid for, or at least get a good referral or something. So I don't think we've even hit that issue. And there were so many ways that we're talking about bystanders, that the young man who killed my niece could have been intervened. Not just my niece, but there were many more ways he could have been. He actually had been identified by the school earlier to go to an anger management class. And no one ever followed up on him. And it wasn't about Maggie, it was about, he had hit a couple of kids, male students, and this big whatever, and no one followed up on him. So we have not even touched this issue. And I'll say finally, one of the reasons why I did this after Maggie was killed, because I had done this work for many years, is that I thought, well, I can help the victims, but we have to get to the perpetrators. And I thought I'd try to figure out, were these programs something of value? And I did work with a number of men who did maybe make some communication issues changes. They got the idea that they wanted to, particularly if they had past trauma histories of witnessing domestic, they wanted to have a generational break in that. They didn't want to pass it on to their kids. But they had to work hard to even get to that place. They had to get hard to continue the resources that were not out there.
And I think that's an important piece that you bring up, is that the services that are available for those who have harmed are much more cognitive check in the box related than they are actual trauma informed therapeutic, particularly actually in the intimate partner arena. I work in all realms of intimate personal violence, but predominantly sexual violence and severe forms of violence like homicides and things like that. And the sexual violence field, we're about 20 years ahead for our perpetration research, risk assessment tools, treatment practices, recognition of the trauma-informed than the intimate partner violence field, because of the resources that have been put into that. So you're also dealing with a disconnect between what is considered most important from a societal perspective that gets the funding and the research. And intimate partner violence is still not viewed as significant as other forms of interpersonal violence, and unfortunately so.
Right.
Yeah, and
I would totally agree with
that.
that. I would totally agree with that concept, because in working with young men who were on probation for various forms of assault, many of them had traumas in their history, and these traumas have never been addressed, and they weren't being addressed. And as I think about my role of being there, was to really help them re-enter society and to relate to their children. But they could not relate to their children till they dealt with their own trauma, their own past, their own victimization. So I think that this is an area that, as we really want to see some reduction in the kinds of things we're seeing that are violent and unpleasant, we have to look at the full spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, in my community in St. Louis, we usually make the top three, crime rates, murder rates in the, in the US. But this comes up a lot. And generally though, it's very difficult because the cynic answer is money, funding. People have much more sympathy for victims than they do offenders. So they are much more likely to pour the money into victimization survivor programs than they are to perpetrator programs. And a lot of times, and this here in my community, the perpetration programs, they lose funding. They're fewer and far between.
And the expertise is fewer and far between in some of those factors. And I do want to just note, my entire career, I have worked with perpetrators, and looking at their trauma histories and recognizing that impact on their developmental kind of progression to where they're at, it does not excuse or mitigate the harm that is caused to the victim. However, I do like to throw out and challenge people when we're talking about adversity and trauma and the impact and kind of the lifelong trajectory. When does someone who is a victim of harm only become a perpetrator of harm? And why are we not looking at both sides of that picture when we're looking at preventing all kinds of violence? Because we have to be holistic in that approach and very comprehensive. So I will say I'm just excited because I've been doing my work for over 20 years, and I was so excited to see every single one of you had something about the importance of also providing interventions for perpetrators, because that is fairly new. And I'm often the redheaded stepchild in the room because I am the one who works on that side.
Are you redheaded?
I think when you do parenting and parenting programs, you really are hopefully setting the parents up to work with their children in a way that is preventive of some of these problems that we see in older life. But it's very hard to do a follow the dots or trace the dots from one situation to the other. But parenting certainly is very, very early on an important element for structure and stability and recognizing problems.
I wanted to add two more things from what Joyce said. Many of the men that I work with for 15 years, it was hard to get them to empathize with their partner and what they had done to their partner, ex-partner, but they want the children was way to get in. So we actually did a lot of fatherhood stuff, because, do you want your children to see you like this? And, particularly the men who were, when they were arrested, their children were present. And that was real, shame and embarrassment for them. So to get the empathy going for your children was great. The other point that I think I've been gathering data on, I don't know if anybody else is, but the number of domestic terrorists, the men who were arrested for particularly for the January 6th, many of them have long violence histories, and particularly in domestic violence. So these domestic violence offenders are showing up someplace else in our system, particularly around guns and around terrorist kind of stuff. And we're just not identifying how this is all connected. So maybe we don't want to, in our little pea brain minds as public policy people, to solve the domestic violence offender kind of issues. Let's pull it to the larger issue that we do have some visibility on, which is gun violence and domestic terrorism. If you look at the men who were arrested, particularly for mass shootings, they generally have some, if not a criminal record, they have some history of being violent, not only with women, and also children, but particularly women for sexual assault or some kind of intimate partner. So it's all there in plain view. There's no question about it.
And that's one of the wonderful things.
We see this. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I was just going to make a tie-in for NPEIV. And one of the reasons I'm involved in NPEIV is because it brings together all of these different disciplines to have these conversations and to recognize this disconnect, because part of what you're talking about, Susan, is that connection between different systems. And if we're not talking together,
right,
then we're failing.
Now, I hate to interrupt this great discussion, but we've got like 5 minutes left, so we won't be doing this wonderful scenario that we've got. But I would like to thank everybody for this great discussion. And I'd like to fast forward through these other slides that we had. and tell you all that if you liked this webinar, to please consider going to the next webinar we're having, which is next Wednesday. And the webinar next week is focused on preventing violence. So this was focused on how do we help people, whether the individual, the family, the community, what kinds of effective strategies do we have for helping people heal? And the webinar next week is how can we move upstream and prevent future people from being hurt. And to tie that back to the discussion, today was kind of about helping victims, but obviously the same strategies help the perpetrators because they're usually victims before they're perpetrators. But next week is on building resilience, which makes it much less likely that someone will have a negative impact if exposed to traumatic circumstances, and public policies that can help prevent future school shootings, bullying in the school, intimate partner violence, because the national partnership is trying to go across all forms of violence and educate people about the common risk factors. So yes, school shootings are not the same as intimate partner violence, but they share some common factors. And if we try to rid our society of these common factors, we'll be protecting ourselves and our children and our most vulnerable. If you want to learn more about violence education and you are not unable to attend next week, you'll see that there are free materials available on the National Partnership website. We would love it, whether you are an individual person who was just interested in the topic, if you work in an educational system, if you work in a criminological system, we would like to have you join us because we are more able to work effectively when we work together with others who have diverse backgrounds. And before all of you need to charge off to your next task, I'd like to remind you that this webinar and the one next week are free because part of the cost, the payment I'm giving back to the state of Pennsylvania for providing this free webinar is that I was giving them information about whether people learned important things about violence from attending. So please, whether you follow the link directly that's being put in the chat and complete it immediately, or I will be sending you the link later. Please help us so that we can offer future free webinars to the public. And thank you all so much for coming.
Yes, thank you all. And without any further ado, I am going to stop the recording. And thank you all. And the webinar has concluded.